Good. So there's a question, very good question by Isa here. Do the limitations of science apply to how we know Islam is the truth? Well, yes and no. So let's explain this. So what do we mean when we say the limitations of science? So one thing that you need to understand in the philosophy of science, when philosophers of science talk about the limitations of science, they don't do it in a way to basically belittle science. No, they're just representing science for what it is. So they're not saying, oh, science shouldn't be used. And even when we, as part of Sapience Institute or as du'at generally, when we talk about the philosophy of science, we don't do it in a way to actually diminish the value of science. Of course we don't. Because Allah tells us to look out into the real physical world, right? You know, our Islamic tradition is very rich with lots of historical it has a rich history of showing that if you have the right social political values implemented in an area, you have people working together to look into the interconnecting principles of nature. For example, in Islamic Spain, you had the convivencia, the coexistence. You had Muslims, Jews, and Christians living under a political governance that implemented the Islamic values of tolerance and justice and mercy. And it facilitated this progress. And we don't have, like, the Islamic history, generally speaking, of course, I don't want to over-glorify Islamic history because nothing is perfect, but we don't have a Eurocentric problem. Like, Europe had the problem with the Catholic Church when it was basically using the coercive arm of the state to prevent any thinking that was incongruous with its doctrines, right? We didn't have that problem, generally speaking. So, and if you read the works of Professor Thomas Arnold in his book, The Preaching of Islam, and Robert Bruffaut and many other historians, they make that conclusion that the Islamic environment facilitated European scientific progress because we had the right values to facilitate people working together to look into the interconnecting principles of nature. And even if you look at the history of science, if you look at, I forgot the historian's name now. His name is it David Miller? I forgot his name, but he talks about the history of science, and he says that Ibn al-Haytham, who was a practicing Muslim, in his biography he talks about that he wanted to look into the natural world to look at how God's will manifests itself, right? And Ibn al-Haytham is actually argued to be one of the key causes or the key milestones to develop the experimental scientific method. So we don't have a problem with science. We love and enjoy science. But when we talk about limitations, we're doing it from, if you like, an epistemological perspective, meaning that you want to show that science has epistemic limits, yeah? And it's not the only method to truth. And it has a particular domain, and it has certain limitations that it cannot transcend, and so on and so forth. And when you understand that, then you know how to use it properly when it comes to your belief system. Because when it comes to Aqidah, we can't have doubt in our Aqidah. So why would you use a method that can give rise to doubt? For example, a lot of science is based on the inductive method or the inductive inference. What is induction? Induction is a thinking process where you move from the known to the unknown. Induction is a thinking process where you move from the observed to the unobserved. For example, I observe 1,000 white sheep, so I'm going to use the inductive inference to conclude the next sheep is going to be white, or I may make a stronger inference and say all sheep are white. Now, you could tell just from this example that this reasoning is probabilistic, because you can have another observation that contradicts your previous conclusions, because maybe the next sheep you're going to observe is not going to be white, it might be black, right? So this is important. So it doesn't lead you to absolute truth. Science is not supposed to lead you to absolute truth. It's supposed to help you work things out and create, good models and explanations for phenomena that you observe in order for you to progress and to try and understand, the physical world in a better way. So from that perspective, you see that it doesn't lead to absolutes. Now, we have to be nuanced. Does that now mean we're going to reject germ theory, that germ theory might be false? I doubt it. So you have to basically understand this from a kind of probabilistic perspective. When things are like, maybe, I don't know, let's pick something arbitrary, like 90% certain from an induction point of view, it's going to be silly. Excuse me. It's going to be silly for you to reject that conclusion from the point of view of certainty. You could say within the scientific domain of knowledge, we can be certain that germ theory is true. But there is a caveat with a very small possibility that it may change or it could be false if we have some kind of crazy paradigm shift. So there are some things that, practically speaking, even philosophically speaking, you're not going to reject. It's very silly. However, a lot of science is not like germ theory, right? So, for example, take even the Darwinian mechanism. The Darwinian mechanism is still probabilistic. It has philosophical assumptions, and there are some disputes about certain things. Yes, there are some things that there are no disputes about for sure. But given that the Darwinian mechanism is a mechanism to explain biological change, which is evolution. Evolution basically means change in biology, biological change. The Darwinian mechanism tries to explain that. Yes, it has lots of confirmations. Yes, it has predictive power, but it still has a probabilistic framework from the point of view that we haven't observed everything. There's so much that we haven't observed. And there are certain philosophical assumptions. For example, if you study the philosophy of biology, you see that gradualism is actually one of the philosophical assumptions of the Darwinian mechanism. And there are certain disputes about certain specific things. Given that's the fact, then I wouldn't say that the Darwinism is like germ theory. So we can say that it's not absolutely true, even though it might work. By the way, just because something works, it doesn't mean it's true. And we've seen this in the history of science. There's no logical link between something working and it being absolutely true. Anyway, notwithstanding, it's important to note that even Richard Dawkins is so evangelical about this, about the Darwinian mechanism, right? In his book, A Devil's Chaplain, or River Out of Eden, I think it's The Devil's Chaplain, he makes a very clear point. And he basically says, we may reject Darwinism altogether in the future based on future evidence, or we may change it and it becomes beyond recognition. So this is very important. Even someone as evangelical as Richard Dawkins, he basically says that about the Darwinian mechanism, because he understands that science is progressive from the point of view that the more observations you have, the more better theories and explanations that you have that are well confirmed and they have predictive power, they can basically supersede? That's the right word. Yeah, they would supersede previous theories that were still working and still had predictive power, but now we've got more evidence and we've got something that's even better. And that's the beauty of science, in my view. So when it comes to these things, you're never going to take these things into your aqidah. Of course not. Because your aqidah has to have yaqeen, right? You're not going to take something probabilistic like that into your creed. So, to cut a long story short, what you're saying now is, can we use a scientific method to actually prove the creed of Islam? No, not in this way. If you're saying I'm going to use induction, right, which means there is a possibility of another observation that can contradict your previous conclusions, then why would you use that to come to certainty about something? And it's as simple as that. Now, I want you to make a distinction between direct observations and a scientific theory or scientific conclusions that are a bit more complex. Direct observations are not necessarily science. They're just observations. Like, I see the moon, it's round. Khalas, that's not really scientific. That's an observation. That is certain. It's like saying, I see X, therefore X. You know, there is no future observation that's going to contradict my current conclusions, right? I've seen it, right? Just like if you go in your garden, you see 5 black crows, and you conclude, I've seen 5 black crows, therefore there are 5 black crows. You're just mirroring your observation and your conclusion, right? So that doesn't suffer from the problem of induction. It's not probabilistic from that perspective. So that's just observations. Now, when it comes to theories and scientific conclusions, it's a understanding. It's an explanation of multiple observations, okay? And they have predictive power, and they are well confirmed. That observations confirm that theory or that explanation of the phenomena. And those type of theories, and many of them, they are subject to change in some way, just like what Richard Dawkins said. So you're not going to use that to basically try and prove something in the Islamic tradition. You're going to use another method of thinking, right? And obviously that unpacks so many different things, because, you know, you could talk about the deductive method, you could talk about intuitions, you could talk about the fitrah, you could talk about experiential stuff. Like Al-Ghazali, he made it very clear about this issue, the 11th century theologian, and he basically said, don't think your iman is going to be kind of solid if you base it on, a carefully structured argument with a conclusion, because someone smarter than you can change around those premises. And what you're going to do, leave the deen or have no iman? Na'udhu billah. No, he's saying to have iman, you have to experience the tradition, and you have to experience the Quran and Sunnah. So, this doesn't mean just because we say the scientific method is probabilistic, or a lot of its theories and the inductive inference is probabilistic, and therefore you shouldn't use it to have conviction in your creed. That doesn't now mean that the only thing we now use is kind of like abstract rational arguments. No, because that assumes that someone's going to be smarter than you. that assumes that you're smarter than everybody else. It could be that someone's smarter than you and they can manipulate your premises, and you'd be like, okay, what am I going to do? And that's why a lot of our du'at have to be careful. We have to have an intellectual maturity, because I see some du'at come up with some stuff and it's like the blind leading the blind. It's like in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And when you study philosophy, you're trained, especially on a postgraduate level, you're trained to play around with premises. You're trained to basically get people to see things that they couldn't see. And you could be like, okay, what now? So we have to be very, very careful here. That yes, obviously there are some first principles using, rational arguments and rational investigation and critical thinking and rational thought that, are non-negotiable. And you don't need to be a philosopher to understand this. But there are many other things that we have to be careful, and we have to be intellectually and spiritually mature, that, this yaqeen doesn't only come from this type of argumentation, just like what Al-Ghazali said. And he's the one who wrote Tahafut al-Falasifa. He's the one who wrote The Incoherence of the Philosophers. He's the one who dealt with the philosophers. He's the one who had his kind of amazing journey from this kind of skepticism to yaqeen. And his yaqeen wasn't just based on abstract rational arguments. It was based on experiencing the Quran and Sunnah. Because when you taste something, I'm telling you, when you taste something, it's so real for you from a first-person perspective, no rational argument can deal with that, right? Because here is an argument. Is there a possibility someone is smarter than you? Is there a possibility that the way you've articulated your argument can be tweaked to the degree that your conclusion is no longer valid, or can slightly change? There's a possibility. Someone can be smarter than you. I see arguments all the time about different issues, and only because I went into academia, I get to understand that actually, well, there's some gaps here. They've misunderstood a link here, logical link here, or what they're saying basically has an assumption that they haven't really unpacked properly. Someone can be. And that's why it's so important to really follow the Islamic tradition. And the Islamic tradition has an emphasis on, yes, yaqeen, having certainty, rational arguments that are in line with our tradition, the Quran and the Sunnah. But at the same time, you have to internalize the Quran and Sunnah. If you don't, you're going to be lost. And that's why Al-Ghazali's life for me is an ayah. It's a sign for us, because his life can be made so contemporary for so many people living in the West. And he understood even the whole concept of ilm al-kalam. He said this is like a medicine. You don't give healthy people medicine, it will get them sick. And he would first assess the psychology of the person before he gave them that medicine, right? So it's very important that we don't just treat the deen like some kind of, we're not Mutazilites. We're not abstract, theoretical, I don't know, ivory tower philosophers. This is not the Islamic tradition. And brothers who come across that way, with all due respect, they haven't studied philosophy academically. And I think they're misrepresenting the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is someone who's on their third postgrad in philosophy. And I'm saying this as to be very clear with everybody. Do not rely on an argument for your iman. Don't do that. Yes, we do have good arguments. We have robust arguments. We have amazing first principles. We have good rational thinking. The sound aql, yes, confirms the foundations of the deen. No problem. We can prove it intellectually. I agree. But I'm telling you, it's not enough. I'm telling you, for someone who wants to engage in this environment, engage in this domain, engage in this sector, you have to protect your heart and follow the advice of Al-Ghazali. Experience the Quran and the Sunnah. So imagine you're someone who experiences the Quran and Sunnah, and you have all the amazing rational arguments. What kind of powerhouse are you going to be? Okay, I hope I made sense. That makes sense. Sorry for going on for too long.